You ready?
Yep.
From the Podcast Detroit studios in the sun-dappled Detroit Shipping Company, this is your Daily Detroit. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. Today's show is all about the past, present, and future of the historically significant, currently mostly vacant, and soon to be dramatically redeveloped Monroe Block in downtown Detroit.
That's right. Today's big news is that Dan Gilbert and Bedrock broke ground on the $830 million reimagination of this area right in the heart of downtown Detroit. The developers say that by 2022, the site will be transformed into more than 800,000 square feet of office space, nearly 500 residential units, and more than 100,000 square feet of retail. There will be two buildings, a 35-story office tower and a 17-story residential building, totaling 1.4 million square feet. Plans also call for a more than 1-acre central courtyard with landscape planners, seating, and retail and food amenities aimed at creating public gathering space and inviting in pedestrians. There's an amazing video that we'll link to in the show notes for this episode on dailydetroit.com.
The Monroe Block is actually two city blocks bisected by Farmer Street. They sit right next to Campus Martius Park and stretch along Monroe Street from Woodward to Randolph. It's not much to look at today, mostly surface parking lots and a single building left over from a mass demolition nearly 20 years ago. It's also home to the wayfinding pop-up skate park. The new towers represent the first high-rise office building in downtown Detroit in a generation, after the building formerly known as the Comerica Tower took shape in the 90s. Detroit simply hasn't seen much in the way of new high-rise construction since it started its long decline more than half a century ago.
This place has quite the interesting history, so let's hop aboard the time machine and go back to the past. Despite the fact that only one of its original buildings still stands, the Monroe Block was designated a Michigan State Historic Site in 1974. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places the following year. According to the Detroit Historical Society, the district originally was home to 13 buildings built between 1852 and 1911. They ranged from 2 to 5 stories in height and were home to grocers, confectioners, saloons, jewelry stores, and pawn shops.
The Monroe Block is best known as being the first theater district in the city of Detroit, starting with the theater called the Casino in 1906, and later including names like the Bijou, the Star, the Columbia, the Family Theater, and the National. Originally designed by the legendary Detroit architect Albert Kahn, the 800-seat National Theater is the only one standing today, but it won't be for long. With the interior said to be too far gone to save, thanks to a leaky roof and years of damage from scrappers, the plan is to preserve its iconic white glazed terracotta tile facade. It'll be moved and become an archway to the bisecting stretch of Farmer Street, which will be converted to a pedestrian walkway and closed to vehicle traffic.
According to our friend Dan Austin's Historic Detroit website, the National opened in 1911 as a vaudeville theater. That Romanesque archway we just mentioned, it originally featured a massive stained glass window, and the twin 64-foot gold dome towers and the arch were both dramatically lit by hundreds of light bulbs at night. It also featured an iron-framed illuminated marquee with glass panels when it first opened. The interior featured a suspended plaster interior shell with a supporting brick structure that's similar to what Kahn used in Hill Auditorium out in Ann Arbor. There were gold leaf designs on the walls and staircases inside those towers that led to the balcony. Over the years, as trends changed and larger theaters opened nearby, the National switched to showing motion pictures, then hosted burlesque shows with a live orchestra for decades. Eventually, that ran its course as well, and the National would close out its run as an X-rated movie house called the Palace. It closed for good in 1975.
The city demolished 12 of the 13 buildings on the badly run-down block in 1990, sparing the National. HistoricDetroit.org has more information and some great photos, past and present, and we'll put a link to it on the website and in the show notes. For its part, the organization Preservation Detroit has said it's disappointed in Bedrock's decision not to try and save the building and find a creative reuse, especially given the taxpayer subsidies it will receive for the redevelopment.
Jer, I haven't been inside the National Theater. I haven't gone spelunking in there or anything, but based on the photos on Historic Detroit, it's pretty far gone.
It was held for a long time by a crony owner of former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, who has let a lot of other properties sit fallow across the city of Detroit, especially on the east side. So it's no surprise to me that this place is shot.
Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Milo Digital. Milo Digital is a full-service digital marketing agency that engineers quality results through data and innovative strategies. Learn more at milodetroit.com.
That takes us to today. Bedrock held a groundbreaking ceremony inside a large tent erected on the project site. The guests were a who's who of government and business, including Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan and Governor Rick Snyder. This is a big deal, as for the past few decades, downtown Detroit has been defined by parking lots, including the Monroe Block site itself. Although they provide easy access for suburban tourists going to sports ball games, they really choke the air out of a city. It means that the only thing that happens are those large events, and that's been the case up to just a few years ago.
Most desirable cities have parking garages incorporated into mixed-use developments, and they build tall. They also have better transit typically than Detroit. So a building might feature parking and offices and residential, or some mix of it. It's at the heart of why Dan Gilbert always says we're going vertical. In the Motor City, it's always a huge point of contention when surface lots go away. We're so hooked into our cars, but that's not going to be the future. Surface lots are very profitable for their owners since there's very little maintenance to be done, and you can charge a ton of money. But they kill any chance a city has at being an actual city.
The Monroe Block has been mostly parking lots for a while. There was a busted-up garage at one end by Randolph, and that came down a few years ago, but no more.
All right, so let's spin this ahead into the future a few years. We saw these renderings. We both watched the flyby video.
Which was amazing.
It's incredible.
Incredible.
So my first sort of reaction is this is going to add a huge dose of density to downtown Detroit, which is a good thing. I mean, one of the big buildings is going to be on the site of what's now this vast parking lot, surface parking lot. It's also going to look, it's going to add a huge modern sensibility to downtown Detroit. I mean, which is largely pre-war architecture, and I'm not knocking it. I love downtown's mix of the architecture and everything, but huge successful cities, Chicago, LA, New York, all have a broad mix of architectural styles.
And I have a little bit to add here because during the ceremony, the designers actually talked about the fact that this was very European in thought, that they saw their development needed to be iconic in itself, and that you can't recreate what was the past. What you need to do is set off of it and showcase it. It's part of why the buildings are so reflective, is because you can see those different things. I'd also mention that, especially, at least in this round of renderings, and they are subject to change, the feel, especially of the largest tower, feels like some sort of mirror modern image of the 1001 building, and that kind of like windows and framed out modern kind of look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the reflective. I love the reflective glass and the way you get reflections of some of those old pre-war buildings, like the Cadillac Tower, which is going to be right next door. And we should mention that Bedrock says the designs are subject to change. I don't anticipate they'll change like dramatically at this point, but the Hudson's Tower has gone through a couple iterations and may still undergo one more before that finally breaks ground, or before that finally gets, building starts. But I also love the central courtyard. I think is really cool, and it's clear that they put a lot of thought into it. There are elevated walkways kind of rimming that, like on the sort of the second floor, which I think, and there's some sort of like flyway bridges like going across that space, which I think is really interesting. Seems like it's going to be like a really lively kind of vibrant space there.
And talking about lively and vibrant, they're expecting a whopping 750,000 people to flow through there each year, which makes it a real destination, and that's a lot of people to put into a couple block area.
Yeah. They're apparently seeking LEED certification, so like environmental sustainability principles in the building, and they're designing it with something called WELL certification in mind. I hadn't heard of this, but it emphasizes health and well-being through criteria around things like light, air, water, fitness, nourishment, and other factors. I mean, nourishment, they're going to obviously invite a lot of eateries, restaurants to open up
It sounds very zen. You know, one of the things that makes me think about nourishment and being inviting and things, one of the things that Dan talked about in the presentation was the idea that they're now actually busing Detroit public school kids into downtown Detroit. A huge percentage of Detroit kids, they found out, have never visited downtown Detroit. They never are part of that. So now they're literally doing field trips to downtown for Quicken Loans.
Oh, that's interesting. You mentioned the European influence. One of the architects, there's a 2-architect firm design team. One of them's from Copenhagen called Schmidt Hammer Lassen. They're joining Detroit's Newman Smith architecture. But they were charged, and they made a lot of point about this. They were charged with adhering closely to good urban design principles. So they're very consciously trying to connect different downtown districts through this development. I mean, connecting Campus Martius across the street, one of the most successful public spaces in Detroit and probably in the country in a lot of ways, to some other Greektown and some other adjacent districts, bringing in a mix of uses and creating vibrant open spaces. I mean, it's like straight out of Jane Jacobs, in the early 1960s.
And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least touch on for a little bit talking about like the business side of this, especially around incentives, because they're rather controversial for a lot of folks. And I found talking to people, an interesting tie between incentives and workforce development. That whole idea that Detroiters need to do a lot of these jobs, but there's not enough people skilled, all that kind of stuff. And I know that incentives are kind of a difficult topic for a lot of folks, and I don't always know how I feel about them. But I will say this, it seems like on this project, at least it's not cash over the barrelhead. It's money that gets taken in from the people who are there after it's actually built, and no incentives are awarded. Like no money transacts hands until it's actually done, which I really appreciate. In the past, the state has not done that, and the state continues to have huge liabilities from things that if you look at General Motors, you look at a bunch of other stuff, they don't have to hit those targets. With this, if they don't hit the targets, it's tied to how much it develops. So the incentive actually floats, which I think is really interesting. The My Thrive that's behind this was actually supported by both parties and in the state legislature. And
overwhelmingly.
Overwhelmingly. And the thing is about that is that the reason why they did this was to create super large projects, because only those large projects create enough demand where it's worth it for people to start going into job training. It doesn't make sense for people to pick up job training to do little small projects if they're only going to be working a month on a job site, a few months. What they really wanted to do, and you can argue with this, I'm just going with like what it was the story I could kind of gather from talking to folks. What they really wanted to do was create a pipeline so it was worth it to spend 12 weeks, half a year, whatever, learning job skills and then actually have a career. It doesn't make any sense to do that if you don't have a pipeline of projects. And Detroit just didn't for a long time.
Yeah. This is, we should mention, it's also part of a larger project representing what Bedrock says is $2.1 billion in total investment. It includes the Hudson site, which they've already broken ground on. The Turner Construction Company is the general contractor for both these projects, and they predict that this is going to generate 11,000 construction jobs over its lifespan, that's a lot of workers in downtown Detroit looking for a place to get lunch and grab a beer after work and so forth.
And that's all great stuff. I'll say this, 2022 is going to be a pretty exciting time, and I'm excited to see this complete.
I am too. I can't wait to see Detroit's skyline grow. And get some new, I mentioned how it's going to be, a dash of modernism into, a mostly pre-war architecture downtown. I can't wait. It's going to be, I think it has the potential to be really cool. All right, friends, we're coming up on the weekend. So as usual, we wanted to thank everyone who helps with the show behind the scenes. That's Cheyenne Nosarini, Randy Walker, our spirits advisor, Neri Gojai, and the folks at Podcast Detroit for having us here in their studio on these crazy busy days. Thanks, Bob and Dave. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. If you like the show, be sure to tell somebody. And of course, thanks to you for listening. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.